All right, I'm going to read Prabsharanbir Singh's paper. I must admit right from the beginning here that I have skimmed it through. I have not yet read it aloud. And sometimes reading it in your head and reading it aloud are two completely different things. To be even more honest, what I was reading it through silently was for extended Punjabi verses in Gurmukhi, which would be absolutely painful for me to work through and painful even more so for you to hear. Fortunately, there isn't any of that. So I think I'm going to try to do some justice to his paper, but please be patient with me if I stumble across a little bit of a cadence or the turns of phrase. And I hope I do justice here. All right, it's called Traversing the Colonial Fantasies, a psychoanalytic reading of Gadar and Komagata Maru. Although there is plenty of literature on both the Komagata Maru incident and the Gadar movement, little effort has been made to make a thorough comparison of these important historical events. There are, of course, parallels between the Komagata Maru and the Gadar movement, but it can very well be argued that these two events significantly diverge from each other. Any desire to see these two events as a continuum or as a part of the same historical narrative might be questioned on several levels. It might be argued that the Komagata Maru was primarily a business venture, while the Gadar movement was an intentional armed resistance to topple the British Empire in India. The protagonist of Komagata Maru incident, Gurdeep Singh, reiterated it again and again that he is a loyal British subject, and he is only asking to be treated as one. On the other hand, writings by Gadarites make it more clear that they saw British colonizers as brutal oppressors, and clearly stated that the only way to rid them is through armed insurrection. Although this juxtaposition seems fair when taken at its face value, and it might seem that there's little commonality between the two, I argue that deeper inspection of both historical episodes reveal hitherto unexplored affinities, connections as well as differences. These affinities and differences are primarily of psychological nature and reveal a shared ideal of resistance against the British Empire. However, the respective resistance was motivated by and articulated through very different and complex psychological processes. The purpose of this paper is to suggest and not claim that it can be helpful to use psychoanalytic theory to identify these psychological processes at work. I'm assuming that everyone present here knows very well about the Komagata Maru incident, so I will spare you, well, he will spare you the details. At the center of the incident was Gurdeep Singh, an experienced businessman who chartered a Japanese ship to take passengers from Hong Kong and other Asian countries to Canada. Darshan Singh Tatva, who's done a comparative study on the Komagata Maru and Gadar movement, states about him, quote, Gurdeep Singh was not a Gadarite. Nevertheless, he underlined the glaring injustice suffered by the passengers, which could fuel a Gadar-like rebellion. He denied vehemently that the ship was carrying any arms, which was, of course, necessary in view of the official assertions that passengers were armed. It is possible that this cargo of arms was dumped at sea, like the Gadar literature, end quote. We know from Sahib Singh Bhaktana's autobiography that he, along with other Gadarites, with another Gadarite from California, delivered 100 pistols to the Komagata Maru during its stay in Japan. Another scholar, Harish K. Puri, has also described the impact of the Komagata Maru on the Gadar movement in these words, quote, the people of the Indian community residing in those port towns were swayed by anger. In the diwans held in the gurdwaras at Shanghai and Hong Kong, the fate of the passengers of the SS Komagata Maru formed a central issue of resentment. The Indians were exhorted to return to India to avenge the insult. It was not a coincidence that the first jatha of Gadarites came from Shanghai and reached Calcutta almost on the heels of the Komagata Maru. end quote. It is clear that both events were interlinked and profoundly shaped each other in multiple ways. But my intention here is not to indulge in locating historical, political connections of the sort Tatva and Puri are making. On a different note, I intend to read these events from the colonial history of Punjab through the lens of a discipline that not only originated in Europe, but still retains its primarily European identity, namely psychoanalysis. But why psychoanalysis? Why read colonial history of Punjab through psychoanalysis? Not because psychoanalysis is supposedly universally applicable discipline of the study of the workings of the human mind, but because these two events are among the most formative encounters Sikhs, the primary actors in both events, had with political modernity, and these encounters are still shaping the post-colonial Sikh subjectivity. In the case of the Komagata Maru, with the global politico-economic networks of empire and their profoundly racialized policies, and in the case of the Gadar movement, with the highly efficient and sinister security apparatus of the colonial regime, which was not only capable of defeating the Gadarites militarily, but was also able to penetrate their inner networks. The brutal oppression following these events were desperate and tried by the colonial administration to make them realize that the only viable way of participating in the political activity is through whatever form of activity the British were offering, and not direct rebellion. I'm sorry, I can't quite get the proper cadence with that sentence. It's not working properly, I'm sorry. The fallout of these events was directly opposite to intention. T.G. Fraser has shown that the British were keen on keeping the Sikhs unexposed to new ideas and ideals of the world, hoping to retain their sense of loyalty by keeping them isolated and immune from revolutionary activity. But the occurrence of these events facilitated the Sikhs' encounter with modernity, and it is due to this encounter with modern ideas and the workings of political modernity that needs a psychoanalytic reading. Joan Kopek, a leading psychoanalytic scholar, defines psychoanalysis as, quote, the mother tongue of modernity, end quote, and argues, quote, the important issues of our time are scarcely articulable outside of concepts psychoanalysis has forged, end quote. Although it can be argued that psychoanalysis alone is not enough to conceptualize the human existence in today's world, still psychoanalysis can be a highly helpful discipline to understand the hidden motivations of political actions and movements. Secondly, scholars like Frantz Fanon, Gayatri Spivak, and Homi Bhabha motivate me to engage post-colonial studies with continental philosophy rather than in isolation of one another. The relative recent rise of psychoanalytic social theory gives us another reason to engage in such an exercise. Psychoanalytic social theory is not just an application of the psychoanalytic concept to social and political phenomenon, but a broadening and transformation of these concepts based on the notion that the individual and psyche are always already thoroughly social. And he cites Kelly Oliver there as work in 2004. It does not provide an overarching theory to fully account for social oppression, but it helps us in understanding the fluidity of power and to account for the role of race and racialization in any situation involving oppression. One of the most important aspects of psychoanalytically oriented social and political thought is to theorize the nature of the ethical political act. Such actions are called the ethical act, or the pure act. The ethical act, in the strict Lacanian sense, is not just any act, but one that comes at a huge price, that of excommunication from the symbolic order. That is the dominant social, cultural order of the time. Slavoj Žižek defines the ethical act in the following terms, quote, when an act which reaches the utter limit of the primordial forced choice and repeats it in the reverse sense. Such an act presents the only moment when we are effectively free. Antigone is free after she was excommunicated from the community. End quote from Zizek. The figure of Antigone is the ironic figure to symbolize the ethical act in the Western tradition. She risked her socio-symbolic status for the sake of her ethical duty and risked being exiled from society. Gadarite motivations were derived primarily from their ethical orientation. They had the choice to acquiesce to the colonizers' desire and live profitable lives. But they saw British occupation of India as illegal and the colonial oppression as morally unacceptable. And so they decided to rebel against the empire. But this brave yet simple step of rebellion against the British Empire had immense psychological consequences for their own subjective life. They risked lifelong imprisonment and capital punishment. But the more important aspect of their persecution is that the colonial regime tried to banish them from the public sphere. Gadarites were not only excommunicated from colonial India's mainstream political sphere, they were also isolated in their daily lives, either by long prison terms in faraway islands or by house arrest. And I think the paper by Roy earlier this morning touched on this sort of notion. It is very interesting to note that their reaction to this excommunication. Instead of despairing and committing suicide, they chose to create an alternate symbolic order. I'm not suggesting that they were successful in creating that symbolic order, but a close analysis of their writings suggests that this is what they tried to do. In the interest of time, I will cite only one example. It is a small announcement about the celebration of Vaishakhi, the Stockton Gurdwara, in an issue of a Ghana newspaper. But the tone and the use of the words are loaded. But the tone and use of words loaded with communitarian ethos shows the creation of a parallel symbolic order. Here's the quote. All Singhs are hereby notified that on Monday, 13th of April, in Stockton, Gurdwara, a very elaborate Vaishakhi Day will take place. This day belongs to the community, the Panth, the Grand King of the 10th Guru, Maharaj, the deemed head of the squad, the Jata, of enemies, of oppression. It is hoped that all the Guru's sons make an appearance and fulfill their duty. Despite the Gadar movement's often acknowledged secular credentials, the Gadar literature is replete with references of this kind, which shows that, in the form of political religious practices of Sikhism, they articulated an alternative to secularized colonial discourse. Their resistance was not necessarily articulated in terms of the discourse of the colonizer, which was obviously present in their discourse, but succeeded in retaining its sovereign voice in the form of using a traditional idiom. The story of the Komagata Maru and the life of Gurdeep Singh exhibit an even more complex story of the psychological dynamics at work. There are 3 extant versions of his autobiography, 2 in Gurmukhi and 1 in English. The English version was prepared in Calcutta with the help of some Bengali friends, while the Gurmukhi versions were completed either while on the Komagata Maru or during his fugitive years. Looking at all 3 versions shows that Gurdeep Singh was a contradiction in himself. On the one hand, he reiterated again and again that he is a loyal British subject and that he only demands to be treated as equal. On the other hand, his writings refer to white colonizers as being worse than animals in brutality and lacking any moral values. I am puzzled by what Gurdeep Singh meant when he said that he is a loyal British subject. Was it just for the sake of convenience, to pass himself as a law-abiding citizen in order to make his case stronger in court, or has it deeper significance? I think he is traversing the fantasy of his colonial masters. It is pertinent to note here that the colonizer, just like the analyst, assumes a position of authority in his relationship to the colonized and becomes, quote, an all-knowing and all-seeing other, who is the ultimate judge of their value as human beings and the final authority on all questions of truth. He's quoting a scholar by the name of Fink there from 1997. Such a positioning creates anxiety and trauma for the colonized subject and consequently pressures him or her to either completely abandon his own desire and start identifying with the colonizer's desire, or to empathetically say no. To enact a purely ethical act and break the trap set by the master. It is important to note here that the situation often gets enacted through two registers of language and desire. The other as other, that is the small o other as capital O other, functions on this double plane of language and desire. The capital O other tries to domesticate the subject's discourse by inseminating it with its own hegemonic discourse. At the same time, robs them of the singularity of their own desire by imposing its desires on them. Do I need to read that sentence again? That was circular. The other as other functions on this double plane of language and desire. The other tries to domesticate the subject's discourse by inseminating it with its own hegemonic discourse, and at the same time, robs them of the singularity of their own desire by imposing its desires on them. But this binary of either sacrificing one's desire, submitting to the master's narrative, or saying a plain and simple no, is not the only way of getting out of this trap. An alternative way is traverse the master's fantasy. Quote, the traversing of fantasy is the process by which the subject subjectifies trauma, takes the traumatic events upon himself or herself, and assumes responsibility for that. And again, quoting Fink. It also, quote, involves subject's assumption of a new position with respect to the other as language and the other as desire. Both Gurdjieff Singh's position vis-a-vis the colonial masters is something like this. Otherwise, he would not be able to express his anti-colonial power feeling so powerfully. He is playing the colonizer's game just to subvert it, and not in the way to acknowledge his superiority. On the one hand, he tries to get justice through the British justice system, and on the other hand, he shows, as he shows in his autobiography, in a chapter entitled British Justice, that British justice is fundamentally prejudiced and delivers only for those who are in positions of power and privilege. And now we're back to Hugh Johnson's comment of the aristocracy and power and privilege. Thank you.